I am presenting what I imagine would be Charles's talk and Rajiv's talk, and it's not what I imagined. So I'm in a hell of a soup, and soup is not my favorite food. So I'm going to present a rather cynical view of secularism, the secular state, quite not to deny what Charles and Rajiv were implying, but to say that it's completely unrealistic. The world we live in is not the world that Charles and Rajiv had enumerated, where you get a multiplicity of religions, and somehow other these religions must accommodate themselves to the reality of the secular state. You see, my argument is simply this. I have there are two important ways in which we can think of secularism. My kind of secularism is a personal secularism, and it's a kind of secularism which Nietzsche defined in Antichrist, you see, where he said that in 1888, this is a very radical view of the death of God. He made the point that though God is dead, the way of Christ is still with us, and with all, many people can still imagine Christ as a way of life, you see. So I have a kind of view of secularism of that sort, that is a personal kind of secularism, which is not what we are going to talk about now. Rather, we are going to talk about the secular state, the kind of political secularism that Rajiv has very nicely enunciated. But political secularism contains what I call, even in the best traditions, such as Charles has enumerated, which I agree with, there's another side to it, you see. And it is that dark side. I'm always given to the dark side of things, I'm afraid. Can't help it, you see. That dark side is what I want to enumerate here, you see. In the first place, I call this the paradox of secularism. That is, secularism requires to some extent a willing or sometimes unwilling suspension of the other religions. That requires that expectation simply will not occur. It will not occur in India, and several people of my colleagues, such as Ashish Nandi and several others, have pointed out the impossibility of that ever succeeding, and with a good old Modi coming into, perhaps into power, and Hindutva coming, I don't see how that model of secularism can last, you see. So I am saying that the paradox of secularism is in the notion that somehow or other the secular state can act relatively independently of the multiple religious forces that are embedded in the larger context, you see. Now I am suggesting, how could that be? How could certain religions be indifferent if they have been affected by this sort of secular state, you know, which contains values which I uphold completely. And I hope the rest of the world upholds values of the freedom of speech, of conscience, of association, and so forth. But I think it is a mistake to assume that that model would operate everywhere. It cannot. You see, if you take certain models, Raju mentioned the case of China. You see, take China. You see, they make no bones of the fact that it is a certain definite kind of secular state in which religion has very little or no place. And they're making, I might even say they make a few bones out of it, you see, you know. But this problem of so there you have one model, a very powerful model of the secular state in which religion has absolutely no place. You can't even mention the word Dalai Lama. You're in trouble, you see. So it seems to me that that's one model. Another extreme is another model which I absolutely despise, Saudi Arabia. Some of you may be really offended, can't help it, you see. I mean, Saudi Arabia is just a reverse, where there is no tolerance whatever for secularism, certainly the secular state. It eliminates all such notions. So there are two extreme models here, and in between you have sort of European models, of which, since I am also happily both a Sri Lankan and an American citizen, of which I am a part, and I really admire some of that. But, it's a big but, those who, like me, who have lived most of our lives in the US, knows that there are certain forces right there which are utterly hostile to the notion of a secular state and the notion that somehow or other, the notion that in God we trust must be reified and so forth. They may not succeed, but the fact that they don't succeed does not mean that these extreme radical evangelist groups, you see, are a power that we can just ignore, you see. And who knows, they might even succeed. So is it, I think, most of the other places that we talk of. Even if you go to Italy today, you hardly see any people in the churches, you see. So you might think, wonderful, here's another good example of a secular state. Good. But let us say that there is a rule that they initiate and say, let's abolish the Pope. You'll find all these people saying, what are you up to? This just cannot be done. What about, you see, the past and so forth? Can you just dismiss them? So I'm saying that these are some of the problems that the secular state thought of. I thought Rajiv was going to talk about the Ashokan model, and I was really very hopeful about it, but I said, please don't mention Tambaya in it, you see.
I mentioned you in it.
Huh?
I mentioned you in it.
Yeah. Whatever it is, I thought he was going to talk about a very, very interesting model, what he calls of secularism, that can sort of be sort of an alternative model of secularism, but whether it could be implemented in reality or not, we just don't know. So when you come to think of our own condition in Sri Lanka, to me, it seems to be a rather dismal prospect, you see. That is, if you look at, let's put it this way. Let us say, for example, that both these people, including myself, put a high value on tolerance. But aren't there limits to tolerance? What are the limits to tolerance? Can any kind of tolerance be tolerated? You see? Now, I'll give you a good example. In Sri Lanka, prior to the 19th century, women, most of the time, some of the time they didn't, foolish of them, kept their breasts bare, you see? But I try to introduce this to Colombo or any other place, you get lynched, you see? There's no way that that model, however ancient and however respectable it was in the past, has no meaning in the present, you see? And these anxieties can lead to all sorts of reactions, including, physical reactions. So however much we say, let's be tolerant, the fact of the matter is that there are certain limits to tolerance which certain communities sort of impose. And it is very difficult to get out of it, Now I'm going to really say that this is also true of other things which we are quite intolerant about. Something that is very close to my heart, not that because I am one of them, that is the psychosis, you see. The psychoses are areas in which we get very anxious, just like the burqa. We get very anxious when we see a schizophrenic woman walking on the road shouting. And we have statements in Sinhalese called Pissage Palamallu, you see. That is, so you get a great deal of anxiety in relation to the psychosis, particularly in Western society and the societies we have unfortunately developed on that model over here. You see, when I was doing field work in Laggala, a very remote area 50 years ago, when you had someone who was, would be viewed as a schizophrenic because he was constantly communicating with the gods, and he was inscribing on his breast also some messages to King George and all these people. People here would have thought he was crazy. Of course he was crazy, but in quite a harmless way. The villagers sort of gave him a job. He had to go to the forest, bring various fruits and so forth, and incorporated this man into their social system. This is very, very difficult nowadays to do. And take the case of people who get into states of possession. They shake and so forth. These damn psychiatrists can't handle that. You see, they're idiots. You see, they don't know how to tackle such a thing, whereas any village kapumatya will tell you how to handle that and bring the patient who has suffered from an illness back to normal functioning, you see. So right through, you have these kinds of anxieties which unfortunately are not properly understood. Now let's get, I have more time? Yes. Oh, good, yeah. I get to green and sometimes not so pleasant land. That is Sri Lanka. Now here, you'll find that on one level, we are a marvelous example of what you have been saying, the secular model with everything in it. Freedom of expression, freedom of conscience, freedom of this, freedom of that. I have the part of the Constitution written. It's a beautiful piece of work, beautiful. But the thing with constitutions is, while they are important, you see, while they contain very important ethical values, and we mustn't be cynical about that, you see, the constitutions work on the basis of precedent, changes that occur, the way they have been reinterpreted in practice, and so forth. So in this sense, this marvelous constitution of ours, which of course to some degree is secular, in the sense that all what we were just saying is found embodied in it, but it has a very interesting clause, a qualificatory clause, and it says, "The Republic of Sri Lanka shall give to Buddhism the foremost place, and accordingly it shall be the duty of the state to protect and foster the Buddha Sasana," the dispensation of the Buddha, at the same time assuring all other religions guaranteed by Articles 1040, all that kind of stuff. That is all the good stuff. Now, I think this kind of clause, we know what, at least most of us know what the Sasana means. It means the Buddha, the Dhamma, and the Sangha. They are embedded in the great discourses of the Buddha, which I greatly also admire, that is the doctrinal discourses. But once you put it in these terms, in my view, we open a can of worms, you see. The problem is that this clause was borrowed from a problem in the Kandyan Constitution of 1815, because the Kandyans, quite rightly, were worried that the British are going to do away with all of this, and through certain clever techniques, persuasion and so forth, they managed to introduce into the Kandyan Constitution the rule that the religion of Sri Lanka, that is Buddhism, there are no other religions, can you believe it, should be protected. You see, that clause, foolishly, has been now dumped onto the Constitution, without realizing there's no need for it, because who would object nowadays for giving Buddhism a proper place? See, I wouldn't. I would also wouldn't object, and no one, I think, else would object to giving Catholicism a proper place. Good. So it seems to be a redundant clause which has very serious implications. One, in terms of what this stipulates, namely, we have to protect the Sasana, the Buddha, the Dhamma, and the Sangha, but doesn't tell you what are the constituent elements of those three great features of the religion. Now we know from history, the historical experience of Sri Lankans, the Sri Lankan kings, we know that there are so many models right through history of the Sasana. Some of them very liberal, some of them very intelligent, some very good, some terrible. Terrible. You commit all sorts of things, including burning books, and then you say you do it for the sake of the Sasana. Then you have notions approaching nearly heresy, you see. Right down to the 18th and 19th centuries, you had this kind of thing operating. So we are really in a bit of a thing when you say when you say the Sasana, there are so many Sasanas, so many realms. But within that, and also within that, there are, in my view, some very good historical precedents which we can adopt in the same way we would like to adopt our certain model. One is Prakrama the second. Unfortunately, but none of you have even heard of it. Prakrama the second, in my view, was one of the great kings who defeated Madha of Kalinga, established Dhammadariya as a capital, and a very wonderful capital, you see. And then he introduced certain reforms of an extraordinary kind. Having defeated these poor Tamil fellows, he said, you better go back home. That's not a normally done thing, you know. Then, one of the interesting things is, prisoners, he released prisoners who have been put into, for minor crimes, totally released. Prisoners who have been convicted of serious crimes, he then reduced their servitude. And in my view, some of the texts that I have collected show that he abolished the death penalty. Now, that's one of the models. There are other models, and you see, there are other statements about the Buddha Sasana, which we simply cannot operate nowadays. For example, Prakrama the first. I don't like him so much as the second guy. Prakrama the first, he also called the great, but there are so many greats there. Grades of greats. So Prakrama the second, you know, Prakrama the first, introduced what he calls katikavati, rules for the order. When the order was contained dussila, bad monks, he introduced rules to reform the order. These rules continued in Sri Lanka periodically till the reign of Kirti Rajasinghe in the 19th century, 18th century, late 18th century. Now, some of the Prakrama the second, my favorite, great deal of discussion of these rules. You see? Now we can't do that. There is no way. The place is full of bad monks, corrupt, name it. Everyone knows it. But how can we institute a reform? Possible within this sort of democratic framework which we all love. So there's a real problematic here. So there is, it seems to me, that there is something even more difficult and more serious happening in Sri Lanka at this time. And that is, if you forget the first model of, you might say, of kingship, see, the state, there is another model which comes of the great Buddhist tradition. That's the model I really like. The model which emphasizes Nanga, Ahimsa, the great Brahma Viharas, four noble ways of living, you see. All of these are part of this, you know, Maitreya, Karuna, Upeka, Mudita, and of course, very important underlying these is what destroys it. What destroys what goes on there is greed, tanha, trishna. Now, translate that these ethical principles, which I strongly admire and believe in it, even though I am not a good exponent for it. The problem is translate that into our own time. Look at it. One of the things is right speech. No member of parliament that I know of knows what the meaning of right speech is. Take the notion of ahimsa. Our society is full of himsa. Himsa. Violence against people, against women. Rape has increased at such a rate, you see. So, it seems to me, take the case of himsa again. We have the highest rate of suicide in the world. Homicide, coming pretty close to it, I'm proud to say. Huge. So what has really happened to our society is one of the problems we cannot show. Underlying all of that is the notion of tanha or greed, and the whole modern economy, it seems to me, rests on that principle. Greed, I must say, Radhika Coomaraswamy returned and probably object to all of this, but anyhow, I think that the modern economy, you see, cannot function without greed. You see, our society, what we call corruption, the institutions of brokerage, whatever they call it, I don't like this, are all rooted in greed. So, the reason behind that is that the kind of society that we have developed, namely the free, what do you call it, free economy? It's still unfree. It's just a mistake to call it a free economy. It's an unfree economy. And whatever it is they're suggesting that there is no way that we can ever produce a Buddhist society. Absolutely no way. So, then we mustn't be too discouraged, and we must sort of follow some of the Buddhist things that, you have a crypto-Buddhist here, you see. See, you must follow some of the so-called model, beautiful model, which Rajiv has sketched. It's a pity he sort of dropped the whole thing.
I'll talk about it tomorrow.
Well, it can reconcile, produce a model of secularism. That sort of it is a very beautiful one. Unrealistic. But that which is unrealistic should not be thrown away. Particularly in the context in which we are living. That, you see, which seems unrealistic, must be given a place. Because hopefully through time, there will be questions, there will be criticism, there will be public discontent, and saying, we don't want this kind of thing. See? And we might be able to institute a kind of model which Rajiv mentioned, and Anne will now very briefly mention. She gives me 5 more minutes. And this is a Buddhist model. Model is based, in my view, the model can be dissociated with any kind of epistemology or anything. Many people will want to link the two, but the whole idea of secularism is some notion of de-linking. See? Now, de-linking is possible in the Buddhist system. For example, the great Brahma Viharas, Mudita, Karuna, Upekkha, what was the last one? Compassion, you see. see, Maitri. These are the great Buddhists. Could not they be universalized? Who would object to it? I can't imagine any Christian living now, any Catholic living in our time, modern day Catholics, particularly with the new wonderful bishop, Pope coming in, you see, who would object to these kinds of notions. Who would say compassion is wrong? I can tell you in my book, I have mentioned similar things within the Christian tradition. So, not just racial, but ancient Christian tradition. So, who would object to that? Einstein, non-her, you see, at least when it deals with human beings, who would say no? So it seems to me that that certain kinds of Buddhist values really can be implemented even among those who are not formally Buddhists. You don't have to be formally Buddhist to implement these values. The advantage of my model, therefore, is that those who are Buddhists can link that with their great traditions. That could be simultaneously de-linked and employed in other traditions. I don't know too much of Islam, but I would say certain forms of ancient Islam, as well as the form I like, Sufism, you see, will be quite sympathetic to what I have now enunciated. So it seems to me that I would like to end this back to my favorite thinker, Nietzsche. Nietzsche, in 1888, postulated that God is dead. God is dead because he felt, like many others did, that the whole trajectory of the 19th century rationality led to the erosion of religious beliefs. Wrongly, I think, but he felt that way, and therefore God is dead. This is in 1888 in a work which is called The Antichrist, you see, and he was a great Antichrist. But, as I pointed out, this great Antichrist also mentioned the fact that all of us could lead the Christian life. We don't have to, in other words, you could de-link, you see, that notion of God and have a kind of, you may say, secular version of the good life in a Christian model. That's all I think.
Thank you.